Typically, I reserve the beginning of the week videos for news topics or, whatever other opinion pieces I think to cover for the week. But last week, in the video I'll link up there, I kind of teased I had a topic to discuss. That being, of course, there was no news, and after about 2 minutes of pretty hefty research, no news. We're going to jump into a very fun and interesting topic, and should be a good time. So before we do that, though, I want to give a quick shout out to the members of the channel. Their lovely names are right here. If you want to join the channel, you can do so very easily. And what that does is gives you exclusive access to certain videos, early access to other videos, this once a week shout out, and also other little perks that I am kind of cooking up. One, in fact, which is coming up, is the holiday letter. So if you would like to receive a letter from me, join the channel, shoot me an email with your address, and I will put you on my list to write a letter to. So cool. If you want to do that, I definitely appreciate the support. If you don't, that's okay too. Just subscribe to the channel, like the video, every little bit helps. So one of the things you might have picked up about me if you've watched this channel for some amount of time, or if you know me personally, is pre-planning is not really a strong suit of mine. I'm definitely more of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of guy, sometimes to my benefit, sometimes to my detriment. One instance in which I feel like I really dropped the ball is the Summer Olympics. Now, for one reason or another, they were a pretty big news story. Controversies, celebrations, all this stuff. And I'm not really here to talk about that. The general idea was it was in the news. And if you might not know, film photography, film cameras, and other memorabilia, stuff I enjoy and like to talk about, has been kind of intertwined with the Olympics for many years. So there's an interesting history there. And I was like, I should have done a video about it, but I'll do one in the future. It just would have been probably smarter if I had done it at the time in which the Olympics were popular. I'm not going to let that opportunity pass me up now because, as you might know, you look outside. Up here I've got the leaves are changing color. The weather is pretty overcast, and there's a certain element of spook in the air, which would lead me to think it's spooky season. I'm going to take advantage of these circumstances and make a spooky season related video. And what better way to talk about things that are scary than death? If you don't know, there has been, since pretty much the beginning of photography, something called spirit photography or ghost photography. So we're going to kind of give a little Reader's Digest version on the history of that and kind of how it shaped a lot of different things and cultural things and whatnot. It's kind of an interesting thing I just wanted to talk about. And I thought, what better time to do it than spooky, scary season here. So we'll jump into it. And if you know more about this topic than I do, which is probably likely, feel free to share anything else you want to talk about in the comments below. If I got something wrong, leave that to yourself. Just kidding. Share that in the comments below as well. And if you want more in-depth information about any one of these particular things, let me know. I'd be happy to go into it more. This is going to be kind of a rough overview. I have about 2 postcards worth of notes, so we'll see how long that gets us in the video today and go from there. If you think about photography as kind of the evolution from painting, especially like portraiture painting, the idea was to kind of capture a person's likeness. And, for one reason or another, whether that's somebody wants to like display their wealth or kind of like show off like, hey, look, I can get this expensive picture taken, or look at these fancy jewels, or just like a heritage piece. Like, this was my great aunt or whatever, and this is what she looked like. All different reasons are kind of abound. But the general idea is capturing some sense of self. Part of that could be kind of tied into people's desire to hold on to loved ones, especially ones that have passed on. They want to see that kind of presence, even though that's not something that you can really capture with any known tools. We'll touch on that in a little bit. In an earlier video, I discussed kind of the rudimentary basis of early film photography. At this time period, it was a process known as a daguerreotype, which I could be pronouncing incorrectly, but it was designed by some guy with the last name Daguerreo. And so far as I understand, the idea is a silver plate with chemicals, light-sensitive chemicals kind of wafted onto it, and then it's exposed to light, and then whatever impression from the light then gets imprinted on the plate. It's a very, very delicate process. In fact, I'll show some pictures here, and you can see on the edges there's etching and scratches. And from what I can understand, basically if you wipe it enough, you could remove the image from the silver plate, which would be kind of embarrassing if you're going through historical archives and you accidentally erase a picture of President Lincoln. But regardless, the process was very delicate, as I mentioned, and also not very light sensitive. So you'd have to have these really long exposures to let as much light in as possible to get more detail in your exposure, so on and so forth. With that in mind, any kind of slight movement in that exposure would kind of create a small impression. Like if you were to move your hand, as I'm moving it, this, you can see the movement, but if I were to slow the shutter speed down of this significantly, you can see more wavy, wafty feel to it, right? Versus now, you can see it's kind of a smoother motion. This is interesting for a number of reasons. One, in family portraits with little children or dogs or whatever, their faces could be blurred out because maybe they moved their head at some stage. And I believe there is maybe a story I heard one time years ago of photographers that would take a stick and put it down the back of a kid's shirt or something like that and kind of tie their head to it or whatever, just to make sure that they didn't move, because if you did, then it would get blurry and whatnot. That was the impetus of this. And I think somebody who noticed this and developed a technique to make ghost photography was a photographer by the name of David Brewster. In 1856, he kind of created a ghostly image. And it was a very popular thing for a long stretch of time until kind of the early 19th century, in which Harry Houdini kind of put a snafu to it and was like, hey, this is all fake, pretty much. I don't know how accurate this is, but that's at least what I read, so that's kind of interesting. But this does beg the question, why was the spirit photography, why was that such a craze? Why were people into that at all? Is this the early iteration of some trashy TLC Long Island medium show, or what? I don't really know, because I obviously wasn't alive back then, but I can only venture to guess that it had something to do with a society's fixation on death. In the late 1800s, especially in America here, there was a lot of death going on. There was a little thing called the Civil War, which was happening, and it was kind of one of the first kind of industrialization, pre-post-industrialization wars that took place in America. Basically, what I mean by that is that the French Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812, those are the three wars I can think of. And also there was conflicts with Mexico and stuff like that. But all of those battles and wars and stuff took place in a time period in which we didn't have cities and definitely not railroad infrastructure as we did in the Civil War, where we had railroad infrastructure, we had cities, and also everybody, for the most part, that was fighting in the Civil War was from America. It was fighting on home turf, basically. That's kind of the whole point of a Civil War, but regardless, it wasn't we have to ship bodies back overseas or anything like that. It's just put them on the train and send them back home. And also at the time, there was not as developed medicinal practices as seen in the statistics on death, because I believe over 1 million people died from the war, which is an incredible amount of people, many of whom died from infections, wrongful amputations. A lot of those people who died also were very young, and some of those were from wealthier families. So there was a practice undertakers would kind of follow the army around. They would sell coffins, they would sell the embalming treatments and all that stuff to preserve the body in order for it to be shipped back to whatever their relatives are or whatever. That way kind of preserving the bodies and stuff like that. And that also is kind of the foundation of our modern funeral homes. All that stuff kind of found their roots in that post-Civil War Americanized culture. And that was also more impacted by the death of Abraham Lincoln, the president at the time who was assassinated. They embalmed his body and took him on kind of a tour of America, kind of a prolonged mourning tour, mourning with a U. Again, wow, this is like the presidential treatment. I care about my loved ones more than I care about the president, so I want to preserve them. That's, in my mind, kind of the thought process going into that. With the idea of like spirit photography or ghost photography, it could offer a sense of comfort to a loved one to know that, wow, this person who died so young and because they got their arm wrongfully chopped off and had a disease and all this stuff, they're still here, they're still with us, what have you. Most belief systems have some afterlife component, and a lot of that kind of relies upon there being a non-physical entity, a spirit, operates the body and then would thus leave the body upon death to ascend to the afterlife or whatever. So to see a spirit kind of in the day-to-day life of like, say if you take a picture of your house and there's like, maybe somebody like walks in a room and walks out, but like the picture itself, you just see like this blur. Well, maybe that's my loved one. Then in like 1859, the technology developed and they created these like exposure plates that you could, use, expose to light, and then you could reuse, creating a double exposure. Double exposure photography is something that still happens today. People use it all the time to create really interesting works of art wherein you take two pictures on top of themselves or multiple pictures or something like that. You can do multiple exposures. It's a whole thing. But the general idea is to kind of layer imagery. So people could take more realistic spirit photographs and layer that into a portrait, for instance. This was seen primarily with another photographer, an American named William Mumler, which is a terrible name. In 1862, he took a very famous photo of him and what he alleges is his cousin who died 12 years prior. Show the picture here. It's just him, and then there's like this floating spirit apparition above him. That picture was so successful, he became a medium for spiritual photography, and that was a business model that existed. So that's cool. In 1891, Sybil Corbett took an hour-long exposure, and it was of a library space. Basically, you can see this like figure in there, and it was alleged to be Lord Combermere, but it's also alleged that that was probably just somebody who walked into frame and then walked out. So it's a course of an hour, so it doesn't really take much to throw that off. And then in France, in 1875, there was a pretty renowned studio photographer who was arrested and charged with fraud for this whole practice. So at least culturally speaking, there's definitely a different interpretation of this. I think in the Americas, there is still that desire for some of this to be right, and the hopefulness that whatever connection can be achieved through this imagery is valid and believable. And in somewhere like France, you get arrested for fraud. So I don't really know what the long and the short of that is, but it is a very interesting concept to think about. As time developed, as technology developed, we saw an increase in accessibility for photography to the average user, meaning they could figure out how to do this themselves, meaning one, there was a lot less mystery, a lot less illusion involved because there was understanding from the masses, which kind of killed a lot of that market. But then two, that means there was a lot more room for experimentation amongst users. Think of something like the Blair Witch Project, which I know we're jumping like a whole century ahead here. And if you've seen Blair Witch, you kind of know what I'm getting at. The general idea is consumer-grade electronics used as a consumer would probably use them, but then adding some kind of supernatural curveball to it. Similar things have happened with photography, but not at like a larger scale, and definitely not enough to fit on my 2 post-it notes here. But there's something like orbs, spiritual orbs and stuff, which is taking a picture of a space, and then those little orbs that you see, those are spirits or ghosts or something, but in reality it's just the way that light refracts off of dust. So I'm not here to like deny ghosts completely, you know, listen. Not to be controversial, but that's just the science, so far as we understand it, does not really point to ghosts existing, and people's attempts to photograph them have been very easily debunked as time and understanding of the technology and of the systems have increased. So too has our understanding of how people have fooled others. And so that's why I kind of wanted to tie it back into like the original iteration of spirit photography, because there was a lot in terms of technological progression happening, a lot in societal progression happening. So to have that kind of like instilled uncertainty of like how things are progressing, well, heck, maybe there are ghosts out there and maybe we can take pictures of them and stuff like that. So it definitely makes sense. And like I said, there was a lot of people that were dying. There was kind of this preeminent fixation upon death and upon passing. And I think that it offers some kind of solace to know that there, you know, the loved one who has passed on, we can see him in the afterlife, or like it's nice to know that there is that presence there. So I think on one hand, it's kind of mean-spirited in a way to exploit that feeling, but then at the same time, if it provides comfort for someone, then more power to them. I just find the whole practice to be very interesting, and it's not something I've like really looked into too much, so I felt like as it was spooky season, it was good to do a little bit of research, look into it, learn some of these people's names, even though I butchered half of them and probably did a very poor job overall. Just the general consensus of spirit photography I do find to be quite interesting. Leads us to the modern era in which people typically take photos on their phones, and phones have apps, and apps can be used to make things look like they aren't, or there's like the filters and stuff that can go on images, try to trick you into thinking there's a ghost there or whatever. Kind of a lame progression, if you ask me, from, you know, people exposing light-sensitive chemicals on silver plates to downloading an app from the App Store or whatever the equivalent of that is, to then take a picture on the phone of a dark room and be like, look, there's a thing in the background, but it's just like a really poorly graphically rendered image of a ghost. Is society cooked? Yes. But anyway, that's pretty much it for today's video. Like I said, it was just kind of a general overview of spooky photography, spirit photography, whatever. Like I said, it's very compelling, very interesting. I like kind of talking and learning more about like the older days. There's a lot, so if I did miss anything, feel free to comment that down below. Let me know if there was anything you wanted to hear more about. Would love to revisit this topic maybe soon, who knows. Thank you all for watching. Appreciate that as always. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. I appreciate that support. Also feel free to join the channel if you would like, and sign up for the holiday letter list. I'll be writing those shortly here and getting in the mail, so if you don't want to miss out on that opportunity, feel free to join the channel. Appreciate that very much. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.